My name is Lucas Norton, and I am the Digital Engagement and Events Assistant for the Jorvik Viking Centre here in England, which is a division of the York Archaeological Trust. So I'm responsible for researching, scripting, planning, and presenting on a range of digital engagement activities, which are designed to, let me do that actually, that's probably a bit better, designed to engage with the public with heritage, archaeology, and history. And quite a large focus of that is upon the history of the Viking Age, of course. As you can tell, we are quite keen on Vikings here in York. Now, as our digital engagement program has grown in scope and scale over recent years, we've added new styles of content to engage with new audiences. And this has heavily included the use of Old Norse literature, the Sagas, and other early medieval texts to produce virtual Viking sagas. But before I dive into that, I'll give you a bit of a background to my organization and why we are so focused upon the Viking Age. So I think if I do this, and make sure I share some sound, you should now be seeing my slideshow, hopefully. If I start showing you that. So can you see that all okay? Yeah? So, the Jorvik Viking Centre, where I work, is a visitor attraction based in York City Centre, and it's all about the Vikings, with a particular focus upon the archaeology of the Viking Age, rather than the literature of the Old Norse period. The centre is the flagship museum within the York Archaeological Trust, which is a leading educational charity and a flagship museum as well. It's a professional organizational archaeological organization which aims to engage the public with heritage through community and educational projects and events, as well as through world-class visitor attractions. Now, the Jorvik Viking Centre is on a street in York called Coppergate, and that street name, like many others in our city, hints at a long-forgotten Viking association, as the name is derived from the Old Norse language. It was once Kupari Gata, meaning street of the cup makers. In the 1970s, this area of the city was scheduled to undergo a major redevelopment, and it was agreed that the archaeologists could excavate the site, which they began doing in May of 1976, initially planning to dig there for 6 months. But the preservation conditions on this site, which you should be seeing on the slide I'm sharing with you now, they were so good on this site, the conditions, the dig was extended to 5.5 years, as there was an unprecedented amount of Viking Age finds. So the dig covered 1,000 square meters, extending 9 meters underground. Thousands and thousands of Viking Age objects were discovered, including rare materials that usually biodegrade. In this case, preserved in deep, waterlogged, oxygen-free conditions. I've got a selection of a few of those thousands of objects here. These include leather shoes, wooden house timbers, pieces of silk, and even a wool Viking Age sock as well. And of course, there were lots and lots of wooden cups and bowls and some manufacturing debris connected with those, which all link very nicely to that Viking Age street name, Coppergate, Street of Cup Makers. Now, the excavation was internationally famous. It received over 500,000 visitors to the site who came to watch archaeologists bring new objects out of the ground and to come and learn more about this fascinating time period. And visitors included Scandinavian politicians and also royalty as well, including the Queen of Denmark herself, who was actually an archaeology graduate from Cambridge University. So no wonder she was so interested. It was therefore decided that due to the great interest from the public and the media about the Vikings on this site, that a brand new visitor attraction would be built to continue engaging with and educating the public about this fascinating time period. So the Jorvik Viking Centre opened its doors in 1984, and each year it receives thousands of visitors, becoming a must-see visitor attraction for tourists in the north of England. So at the centre itself, we've got a ride, which you can see here on the slide. It's a recreation of what the street is like, or was like, I should say, in the Viking Age, in the mid-10th century, based upon archaeological evidence. So the houses we have are rebuilt in the same style, in the same locations as the originals. The professions you'll see the Vikings engaged in match up with evidence found in association with each household. Market traders are also selling replicas of objects from the site, and even the plants and animals that you see match up with biological remains. And we, of course, have our museum gallery as well, which is filled with a selection of the best objects from the Coppergate excavation, supplemented by objects from other Viking Age sites across York city centre, including coin-making tools, musical instruments, and even some fossilised Viking feces, which our museum is quite famous for, the world's largest fossilised human poo. Now, interpretation of this collection is provided by a friendly team of costumed Vikings, known as our interactives, which until very recently included myself until I changed job role. And overall, the ride and the museum exhibition, they're very much focused on social history, what life was like in the Viking times, the lives of ordinary people on this street in this city from the mid-9th to mid-11th centuries. We look at what their houses were like, their diets, their professions, their clothing, and their recreational activities. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed, I've been talking on and on and on about Viking Age archaeology so far, and I've not yet touched upon literature, sagas, or Old Norse, but this is where that all comes into it. So here at Jorvik, we've recreated what life was like here in the Viking Age, but unfortunately, what we don't have is the actual names of any of the people who lived on this street 1,000 years ago. We don't have their life stories, their opinions, their loves, their hates, their relationships with each other. All we have are objects that these people left behind from long ago. But thankfully, we have other sources of information to draw upon, which has helped us flesh out the interpretation of Jorvik Viking Centre all the way back in its very beginning. And that, of course, is the Old Norse saga literature. So the museum has changed a lot since it first opened in 1984, but even in those early days, there were elements of saga literature which were drawn upon to deliver our museum's interpretation. So on our ride, it's completely populated with animatronic Vikings going about their daily lives on a day, I think in late October in the year 960. And these animatronics all have characters, personalities, and names. And those names are all drawn from saga literature. So for example, we have Asgerða, the weaver, which you'll see here on the screen. A prominent character named Asgerða can be found in the saga of Gunnlaug Serpentan. In the middle, we have Sigurd, the antler worker, named for the very prominent saga hero from the saga of the Volsungs. And of course, our most photographed animatronic Viking is Bogar, the Viking on the toilets, which you'll see on the other side of the screen there. Lots of characters in the sagas have names that are variants of that, Bogar or Bogi, meaning the word bow for a bow and arrow. Now, these animatronic characters, they are all fictional. We've invented these people, and they represent the types of people who are active on this Viking Age street, combining the archaeological information that we have with accounts of what ordinary people did based upon saga literature. But even in the very earliest version of our ride, there was in fact a saga celebrity in the midst. If you came to the museum in the 1980s, which was before I was born, you would have met Egil Skallagrimsson himself. He's the chap here in the middle with that strange sort of helmet hat on there. Egil Skallagrimsson, of course, is the slightly psychopathic warrior poet who is the star character of Egil's saga. And in that story, he visits York. So here he is depicted shopping on the markets of Coppergate, presumably buying something nice for his BFF, his best friend forever, Arinbjorn, after composing the head ransom poem for King Eric Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild. But along with our animatronic characters, there are the staff themselves. So here I am in my alter ego as a Viking. Our costumed Vikings all adopt an Old Norse name, and these are drawn from saga literature. For instance, when I was in this role, the name that I drew was Kjartan, which is from Laxdala saga. And we often will build a fictional character story for ourselves as well, which is drawn from saga literature too. Besides this, though, it's fair to say that we're still very, very much focused in the attraction upon archaeology rather than literature. So when I first began working at the Jorvik Viking Centre, most of the information that I was taught by my colleagues, which I then chose to research further, was still very much object and archaeology focused. However, this changed when I joined Jorvik's education team, where I began delivering learning workshops to school children. And it was in this role where I was introduced to the very weird and quite entertaining world of saga literature and the value of using this resource to immerse young people in the culture of the Viking Age. Now, as I'm sure you are aware, due to the nature of when and where saga literature was written, much of the action within the sagas is set either in Iceland, very specifically, or within a kind of a vaguely defined semi-mythical landscape of trolls and dragons, whilst other parts of the Viking world, and we know the Vikings traveled far and wide across 4 continents, these other places make glorified cameo appearances in the voyages of Icelandic travelers. But here at Jorvik, based in York, we are very lucky that the city of York is actually one of the few places in England which appears in saga literature not once, but multiple times, which greatly added to the value of this literature as an educational tool. So I've listed here a few of those sagas where York makes an appearance. So from my colleagues in the education team, I was taught that York appears in Egil's Saga, in the famous head ransom poem, which was composed, Egil's Saga, the famous head ransom poem was composed in York, supposedly, according to the account presented to us, by Egil for King Eric Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild. That scene is set at a site which theoretically may have stood literally just around the corner from where I am now, around the corner from our school classroom, as a place called King's Square, referred to in the original text as Konungas Gathur. And there's a picture of the street sign there for King Square. And this really makes our workshops come to life, of course. Our famous Jorvik Viking Festival as well also makes use of York's sometimes prominent role within saga literature. For example, we adapted the story of the Viking conquest of York from the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. We also like to select themes and examples drawn from the sagas. I can show you an example from some of our festival marketing as well. So you should be able to hear the audio on this as well. This is a trailer for a festival where we use the sagas to draw prominent examples of Viking women.
You know our sagas, timeless tales spun by skulls and spanning centuries. Tales of heroes, of battles, of gods and kings, of the sons of Ragnar and Eric Bloodaxe, a fearsome warrior, powerful men indeed. But what of the stories we haven't told, the stories we have forgotten? What of the women? Women such as Gunhild, wife to Eric and mother to royalty, and Aud, the deep-minded, voyager, settler, diplomat and leader, and Sigrid the haughty, proud, powerful, vengeful, Hed, Visna and Viborg, Viking shield maidens, every bit the equal to any sons of Ragnar. Their deeds shape the fate of many men, and yet where are their sagas? Smothered by the shadows of greater men? A sentence in someone else's story, forgotten by time and ignored by history. It's time to wake up. It's time to remember.
So very exciting stuff there. Now, if you actually came along to the Jorvik Viking Festival that year, you wouldn't actually meet those characters, unfortunately. You also wouldn't really be told their story as such outside of a kind of a battle show that we have with some fireworks. So I would fully admit that we weren't using Old Norse literature to its full potential within both our exhibitions and public events. We often used it to simply add a kind of layer of narrative over our displays and interpretations without necessarily diving too deeply into the original source material. However, this all changed in the year 2020, when the whole world changed, of course. Lockdown. So, in March 2020, the nationwide lockdown, which was imposed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, required that Jorvik Viking Centre closed to the public. All of our events and all of our education activities were cancelled too. This period forced us to be innovative and imaginative in developing new ways to safely engage the public with the history of the Viking Age that didn't rely upon our ride, our interaction with objects either, and this naturally led us towards digital engagements. This initially began with swapping out our school learning program to a digital format, building a replica of a Viking house with live stream equipment in which school children could meet a Viking from the comfort and the COVID-free safety of their own classrooms. Depending upon the workshop selected, they could meet with a Viking warrior, a trader, a settler, or of course, a Viking skald, a storyteller who would recite tales of mythology from the Eddas. And once again, they were told the story of Egil Skallagrimsson's head ransom poem that took place in the city of Jorvik. But the most exciting element of our new program of digital engagement, which ultimately led to a complete change in my job role, was the launch of our digital festival in February 2021. That's Jorvik Viking Thing. So in the Viking Age, a thing was a gathering, a place where leaders could meet, negotiate, and talk. So this was our 21st century take on that traditional Viking Age concept, a virtual Viking thing. This was billed as the world's largest digital online Viking festival. And this event brought together both live streamed and pre-recorded digital content from academics, musicians, educators, authors, and Viking museums and attractions from across Europe, including Dublinia in Ireland, Gunnarsgard Viking Museum in Sweden, and the Lofotra Viking Museum in Norway, all of which culminated in a live-streamed evening with Einar Selvik of Vårruna, the Nordic folk composer and musician. But my role within this digital program was to create what became one of the most popular elements of the whole event, a piece of entertainment based upon Old Norse saga literature. This was our first ever virtual Viking saga. Whilst working from home during lockdown, I was tasked with selecting a suitable saga, adapting that into a script for me to perform as Jorvik Skald as part of a 6-part storytelling video series. Now, the task of adapting a medieval saga for a modern audience was quite a daunting project, as anyone who's familiar with saga literature will understand. The sagas are not at all like modern novels. They often lack features that we would take for granted in stories. For example, they lack very detailed descriptions of landscapes or appearances. You can read all of the Icelandic sagas, for instance, and not really get a clear sense of what Iceland looks like. Volcanoes, for instance, don't get mentioned. People aren't described in great detail either, unless they're exceptionally ugly or wearing an exceptionally weird outfit. Some of the great family sagas, they have a habit of rambling on for many pages about side characters who don't have that much importance to the main narrative. Very interesting stories, but you get a bit lost in them if you don't know what you're doing when you read them. The introductory sections often cover multiple generations of a family who all have frustratingly similar names. You have, for example, Thorolf, father of Thorvard, father of Thorstein, father of Thorbjorg. So quite difficult if you're not familiar with Scandinavian names. The stories often go on for many more pages or chapters after the main story has clearly concluded as well, and you're wondering why we're now hearing about extra characters when the main characters clearly finished their adventure. Characters break into poetic verse at quite seemingly bizarre moments as well. It's very Lord of the Rings. This requires knowledge of kennings and skaldic poetic styles to understand what's going on. Strange supernatural elements pop up sometimes, which can be quite confusing if you're not familiar with this genre and the culture in which the sagas were composed. So what we ultimately needed to do was make a saga into something that an ordinary person could understand, and most importantly, something they would enjoy without necessarily requiring a short university course in early Germanic literature. So to make things easy for myself, I avoided the great family epics, as well as the overtly supernatural sagas, to select one of my favorites for this first ever virtual Viking saga. I chose the saga of Rever the Sly, also known as Krokkarev's saga. I felt this saga perfectly met the themes of our online festival and the brief set out by our festival manager, as it follows one main protagonist, the title character Rever the Sly, and follows his adventures, which lead him from being an unpromising lazy man to becoming a man of both fame and greatness, making use of comedy, interesting secondary characters and antagonists, as well as just the right level of violence. Not too much so it's excessive, not too little to make it boring. It perfectly encapsulates those disputes within Icelandic sagas, where a very small neighbourly dispute over something like a fence boundary or where you're grazing your sheep just grows and grows and grows and escalates, ultimately leading to violence, death, and outlawry, quite a typical trope within this genre of literature. The main character is not a god, they're not a prince, they're not a war leader. They're an ordinary man who lived in the Viking Age, who got caught up in a series of events, which ultimately led to conflicts, his own personal wealth growing, and most importantly of all, it leads to a good reputation for him, the key thing that every person in the Viking Age wants. This particular saga is quite short as well. It was still slightly too long for the proposed running time, which required me to be selective in which material to adapt. The story was filmed within a replica Viking house, but the action within the narratives takes place within the fjords of Iceland and the windswept wilds of Greenland, which required me to add a certain degree of descriptive language in order to take our viewers' imaginations on a journey to the frozen lands of the early medieval North Atlantic. Also, I had to invent much of the dialogue as well, quite a bit expositional, to explain actions and events from this unfamiliar culture to a modern audience, whilst of course ensuring it's within the keeping of saga literature. And due to the enclosed space and social distancing restrictions, I had no cast of actors to support me portraying the characters within the saga. So I had to be both narrator and provide a voice for each character within the saga, though thankfully we did make use of animations to help things out. So I've got a short clip of that saga I can show you here. This is part of episode 4. So hopefully you should be able to see and hear this now. So, our hero Rever had slain his enemy in Iceland and proven his astonishing skill as a craftsman, building the finest ship ever seen in that land. He had sailed away from Iceland with a crew of loyal men and travelled west to Greenland. When Rever and his crew arrived, they sailed in between two glaciers and up a fjord where they found a pleasant green forest filled with animals to hunt, good fishing and lots of timber. They lived here for a while. They built a hall and a boat shed to store their ship from Iceland. They then built themselves a smaller ship and sailed further around the coast to search for the western settlements. When they arrived, they went to a farm named Hlid, owned by a man named Bjorn. Bjorn had one daughter named Helga. She was intelligent and highly skilled, considered to be one of the best women in Greenland. Bjorn had heard of Rever's skill as a craftsman. He asked would he help him work on his farm. Rever of course agreed, and the first thing he did was he built a magnificent house for Bjorn and Helga to live inside. He soon asked for Helga's hand in marriage, and both Bjorn and Helga eagerly agreed. Bjorn soon died, so Rever and Helga took over the running of the farm together, and they became very wealthy very quickly. They had 3 sons named Stein, Bjorn, and Thormod, named after their grandfathers and Helga's foster father. Together they lived a happy life for 8 years. Rever became famous. He built all sorts of famous fine buildings across Greenland. He then built himself a shed at the far end of his land where he began building himself a brand new ship. He worked on his new ship all day and would leave the shed at night walking home unarmed. But one evening when he left his boat shed, he realised he was not alone, because a huge creature had emerged from the snow. It was a Hvítabjörn, a polar bear. It had followed his footprints to the boat shed, and when it saw him, it charged towards him. Rever was eager to fight the bear, as he had no weapon to fight with. He calmly and quickly returned to the boat shed and grabbed one of his tools to ready himself for a fight with the bear. However, when he came out the shed, the bear was already dead. It had just been slain by his neighbour's sons who had come to shore after a fishing trip. Rever was disappointed, but satisfied the bear had been dealt with, so he returned home. And so begins the cycle of violence from that scene onwards between Rever and the sons. That was back when my lockdown beard was quite a bit bigger as well. So this was a short clip of our 6-part video adaptation of the saga of Rever the Sly. It was filmed and edited for us by local production company Inkblot Films. They provided the animations for us too. And this proved to be a very popular part of our digital festival. And it allowed us to reach a worldwide audience who at that time were of course trapped indoors in lockdown and starved for entertainment. There's only so many times you could binge watch Tiger King again and again, of course. The episodes were released gradually throughout the festival week, and we saw consistent viewing figures, and even some people who were binge watching the entire saga in a single sitting towards the end of the festival. The entire digital festival had proven there was a huge audience out there, an international audience, that may actually never have the opportunity to come here to England to visit either the Jorvik Viking Centre or our annual festival in the city centre. And they were eager to not just learn about Viking archaeology from academics, they were also eager to be entertained and learn about the Vikings' culture, history, and their storytelling traditions through the medium of their sagas. Feedback from viewers indicated they found the saga videos to be entertaining and engaging, the themes and characters were relatable, and most importantly, they thoroughly enjoyed it. It was therefore decided that the digital programme would become a permanent part of Jorvik's public engagement programme, and based upon the positive reception to the saga of Rever the Sly, my role as Jorvik's digital scout suddenly became a major part of my job, with many more saga adaptations to follow. Videos of fireside saga-telling sessions have now become a regular feature planned into our digital festival, with specific sagas selected to correspond with themes and messages of our festival and events programme, which reflects the very rich variety of characters, plot lines, and adventures to be found within saga literature. These have been aimed at a general audience, both adults and children, though some adaptations have been designed specifically for children to view. The children's saga content I have adapted is largely focused upon mythology stories taken from the prose and poetic Eddas, including some of the slightly predictable ones, like the tests of Utgard Loki, along with Thor's quest for the Great Cauldron, but also there are some slightly more obscure stories there too, like Lokatatru, or Loki's Tale, a traditional Faroese ballad featuring the trickster god Loki as protagonist and heroic figure. These centuries-old sagas and myths are adapted into fireside stories for children, and they act not just as short pieces of entertainment, but hopefully they impart a small life lesson for viewers too. For example, Loki's Tale teaches that cleverness, planning, and speed are superior to brute force and overwhelming size, as Loki assists a small boy escape from the giant Skrymir, who had won the boy in a very strange gambling game over a game of Nefertafel with the boy's father. We have also begun making use of that library of virtual Viking sagas as part of our school's outreach offer, providing these adaptations to participating schools to encourage not only interest in this historical period, but also to meet school learning objectives too, to inspire creative writing exercises and provoke discussion about the actions, morality, and motivations of Viking Age characters. But in addition to these video format virtual Viking sagas, we have another platform on which to engage in Viking storytelling, and that is our podcast, titled That Jorvik Viking Thing podcast. The podcast was initially launched as a short-term project to accompany our Digital Viking Festival in February 2021, and was designed as a place for academic and Viking history enthusiasts to be interviewed and share their expertise on specific aspects of the Viking Age, such as modern Viking-inspired music, the history of Viking reenactment, and Viking Age archaeology. But here is a much more dramatic introduction to the podcast I can show you.
In Viking times, a thing was a gathering, a place where leaders and warriors could meet and talk.
In the 21st century, our thing is a virtual place where history academics and enthusiasts from around the world can come together to share knowledge. We're your hosts, Miranda Schmiederer
And Lucas Norton. So hold on to your helmets for this episode of that Jorvik Viking Thing podcast.
So there we go. This was initially hosted exclusively by my colleague Miranda Schmiederer, and I appeared as a special guest in a single episode, in the very first one, discussing Old Norse literature and our sources of Viking stories, both the Sagas and the Eddas. But later that year, it became apparent that there was clearly an audience out there with an appetite for Viking stories. So I was asked to join the Jorvik podcast team on a permanent basis, adapting the Sagas into audio dramas. We had decided to select elements of saga literature that could match up with seasonal or currently topical themes. And as it was October at this point, I was tasked with scripting a saga adaptation for a Halloween episode, which was very, very exciting. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Old Norse literature is filled with all manner of horrifying creatures and unsettling stories, which are downright weird. So this was an amazing time of year to begin our first saga podcast. For this Halloween episode, I selected Øyrebukja Saga, perhaps the spookiest and the creepiest within all of saga literature. This involves numerous appearances of the Draugr and the Apturgangur, aka Viking ghosts and zombies. And they are defeated in the most stereotypical Icelandic saga method. They are summoned before a chieftain at the local thing, and they are outlawed. There's even an appearance by a spooky demonic cow as well. And demonic cow strangely became a somewhat major feature of future saga episodes too, but more on that in a bit. I've got a short clip here from our Halloween episode that you can listen to as well.
The next morning, news of another tragedy reached the farm as the shattered wreck of Thorod's ship was found on the beach. But the corpses of the crew were strangely nowhere to be seen. A funeral feast was prepared with what little food remained, but the sadness was quickly interrupted by a horrific scene. They first noticed a strange smell of salt water, fish, and rots, and soon heard a dripping noise. Drip, 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 it continued, followed by the shuffling of broken, swollen feet, and in came 7 men, with seaweeds and sand stuck to their ragged clothes. They were swollen and blue, and terrifying to look upon. The folk in the hall recognised these men as Thorod and his crew, the very men who were mourned at that feast. Everyone welcomed them and offered them food and drink, but the group ignored them. The pagans in the hall declared that the goddess Ran had clearly favoured these men, whilst the Christians declared it's a miracle from Almighty God. But it was soon clear to everyone that God didn't do this. The devil did. The men were clearly Draugr, and everyone fled in terror from them. They caused no harm though, but simply sat by the fire at the centre of the hall, shuddering, shivering, and moaning as they tried in vain to warm their frozen bones and to dry the seawater from their dead flesh.
So spooky stuff indeed in the Viking sagas. Now, this episode for Halloween proved to be incredibly popular, with very strong download figures worldwide, particularly in North America and Australia. And it's helped establish Viking storytelling as a permanent feature within our podcast schedule. Our skills have also grown. We've become more and more familiar and more ambitious with our storytelling, as we now make use of a library of immersive music and sound effects to add to the atmosphere of our episodes. We also make use of animations as well for video adaptations of the episodes too. I've actually got a very short one I can show you as a promotional clip. This was for this is advertising a collaboration we did with a comedy podcast called The Silly History Boys.
Sagas don't have to be serious when you have
The Silly History Boys Show.
So yes, we've included animation for episodes, and we're planning to make that a regular feature for our saga episodes in the future. All of our stories now feature a full cast of voice actors as well, which is a relief for me. I don't have any more silly voices for each individual character. The voice actors are made up of members of our front of house team at Jorvik Viking Centre, and that's resulted in quite an eclectic range of accents amongst our supposedly Scandinavian Viking characters. We've recently had a very, very Welsh Valkyrie, a very north of England Yorkshire King Harald Hardrada of Norway, and also an awfully well-spoken Ivar the Boneless, who sounds like he was educated at Oxford University or something. Every saga is also followed by a short, light-hearted discussion in which myself and my colleague Miranda discuss the story, explain the source material, and we analyze the characters and events, all in a very conversational, accessible style, suited to listeners who don't have any background in early medieval literature. I've got another clip I can show you of one of our more recent episodes where we make use of voice actors and sound effects. This is our adaptation of parts of the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, where the sons of Ragnar invade Sweden.
Ivar ordered his warriors to utterly decimate the land of the enemy, to force him to meet them upon the field of battle. As the Swedish forces arrived, King Oystein shouted,
"We march to war, and our victory is assured. We've got a Sibylla on our side. Her powers shall destroy the wits and will of these Danish vermin."
The Swedish host marched forth and clashed with the spears of the invading Danes, and the forces were evenly matched, so none could guess with certainty who would win the day. But then, the power of Sibylla was unleashed. She took the form of a hideous, monstrous cow, and the vile noises she could produce were horrifying and indescribable, which led Ivar to shout out,
"Clatter your weapons against your shields, drown out this demonic dread with a deafening racket of our own."
The men did as instructed, and then Ivar had his men carry him closer to the horror that was Sibylla. Then, with his largest hunting bow, he shot 2 barbed, brutal arrows, which flew through the air like angry hornets, and each embedded deep into the eye sockets of the demon, blinding that malevolent devil. Sibylla screeched in hellish agony, but Ivar ended her torments by ordering his men to hurl him skywards with all their strength, leading him to crash upon Sibylla's back, shattering her spine. The Danes roared in triumph before rushing forwards and cutting the enemy Swedes and their king to pieces.
I'm particularly proud of the demon cow sound effects we had to put together for that episode. Our Viking storytelling doesn't only provide a source of light entertainment for our listeners, though. We also use these centuries-old stories to confront modern misconceptions that people might have about the Vikings. For example, over March and April of this year, we have made use of Old Norse literature as a key source for discussing the roles that Viking women played in their society, highlighting short stories and poems about the everyday lives of women as expert craft workers, community matriarchs, and sources of counsel and wisdom for their communities. We've also created saga adaptations to correspond with Viking-themed popular culture events. For example, when the first season of the TV show Vikings Valhalla aired on Netflix last year, we launched 4 successive storytelling episodes focusing on key characters from the TV series, exploring the original versions of these characters from the literature, using Heimskringla, the sagas of the kings of Norway, to tell the story of King Harald Hardrada, the Vinland sagas to tell the story of Leif Erikson, and the Latin language Queen Emma's Encomium to tell the stories of King Canute the Great and his wife Queen Emma of Normandy. Whilst in the near future, we're also hoping to produce episodes exploring examples of and attitudes towards homosexuality and transgender identities that occasionally crop up within saga literature. When full cohesive narratives aren't available due to the nature of the surviving saga literature, we've also gathered together multiple sources to take listeners on a journey through particular themes or concepts within the culture of Old Norse literature. For example, voice-acted extracts from Ynglinga Saga, Heimskringla, the Saga of Eric the Red, as well as the poems Havamal and Sigurdrivamal, have all been combined together with myself as narrator to weave the listener on a journey through the enigmatic and confusing world of Viking Age magic, touching upon the origins of sorcery, the use of runes, the gendered aspects of magic, as well as the utterly horrifying abilities of the god Odin, once again followed by a light-hearted discussion. And I believe I've got a short clip of that I can show you with our spooky Odin voice.
Like many things in Norse mythology, the precise origins of magic remain frustratingly vague and ill-defined. Where does magic come from, and why do specific individuals appear so gifted with mystical talents? Is this an ability that one is simply born with, passed on from mother to child? Or must one seek out wise teachers who can pass on secret words and movements which allow one to, say, turn animals into water goblets? Or perhaps knowledge is not the key. Maybe those who are skilled in magic fundamentally view the true nature of the world, understanding and manipulating its falsehoods and contradictions. After all, the stories tell us that human beings are animated wooden logs wandering through the skull of an ancient giant in the roots of a multiversal ash tree, all of which spawned into being from a timeless void of yawning non-existence. Perhaps true understanding of this mystifying mess of a reality is what grants one the insight and skill to perform unnatural, impossible feats. But as always, when we are in need of obscure ancient wisdom, then there is no better place to start than with our old friend Odin. In the poem Havamal, Odin delivers his advice and musings upon life to mankind, but he also boasts of the secret and supernatural powers which he is capable of, even suggesting who instructed him in these abilities.
It was from my uncle, the brother of my mother Bestla, the famous son of Bolthorn, that I learned 9 mighty spells. I know many magic spells that no man or woman knows.
Which he then goes on to list, and they're rather creepy indeed. Lots and lots of necromancies involved. So the development of this content requires extensive research of the source material, which often involves having to decipher some of the slightly clunky and awkward English language translations made by 19th century British scholars, and then filtering the key parts of the saga into a script, often removing the more problematic plot elements, such as those featuring incest and infanticide. For example, I've recently reread the Saga of the Volsungs and counted 6 incidents of innocent children being massacred. So we try to brush over those just a little bit. We update the dialogue into modern understandable English, and in some cases invent new dialogue that's in keeping with the style of the saga and true to the original narrative presented in the manuscripts. In fact, our most recent episode, released on Monday of this week, was a perfect example of the current style of saga adaptations, in which we've drawn upon all the various mentions of the Queen Sigrid the Haughty from across multiple sagas of kings and created a cohesive, entertaining narrative out of that. But why do we do these adaptations, and why are they so popular with our audiences? It's fair to say there's been an interest in the Vikings in Europe and North America, reaching all the way back to the 19th century. And we've seen over recent years there's been an explosion of interest in the Vikings across popular culture, in modern media for both adults and children. Perhaps people who studied very little or nothing at all at school relating to the Viking Age have now found themselves engrossed by characters presented in media such as the TV series Vikings or The Last Kingdom, or films like The Northman or How to Train Your Dragon. Old Norse and Germanic literature have inspired elements of modern fantasy within series like The Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire. The Vikings have inspired video games like Skyrim, and there are even Viking-inspired species of Pokemon in gaming now as well. But I think that the public want to understand the truth behind this modern entertainment. They want to learn about the original texts that inspired and shaped the modern stories they know and love today. But they want this information presented in an enjoyable, understandable, and easily accessible format, which is where our short video and podcast adaptations come in, our virtual Viking sagas, which present the expertise of Jorvik Viking Centre in clear modern English, educating and inspiring interest in this literature, but not taking ourselves too seriously as we do it, poking fun at and having a laugh at the quite quirky story elements that present themselves. We're very proud to have recently passed a major milestone of 50,000 downloads worldwide for the podcast. And this week, on Monday, the 24th of April, we had our most downloads ever for a single day, on the day of the release of our adaptation of the saga of Sigrid the Haughty. Interestingly, it's also worth mentioning, we've occasionally tried adapting literature from other time periods, like classical Roman texts, medieval ghost tales, and 18th century short stories, but these receive nowhere near the same level of interest as the saga stories do, and our fan base gets quite vocal, demanding we go back to Vikings. There's something about Old Norse literature that people love. The characters are both relatable, often being normal farmers and housewives, yet somehow they're also heroic and exotic. The setting is somehow both familiar in terms of landscape and locations, yet also alien and intriguing, set within another time. And I believe that even in 1,000 years' time, in the 31st century, people will still be engrossed with saga literature and adapting it using storytelling techniques and technologies that we can't even imagine yet. So what's next for Virtual Viking Sagas? This summer, we are planning our first multi-episode adaptation of saga literature, producing an adaptation of perhaps the most epic and influential of the sagas, which is the saga of the Volsungs, and already our staff are arguing over who gets to voice Fafnir the dragon. Halloween bestiary episodes are in the works, exploring Old Norse dragons, the undead, and the horrors that lie at the depths of the ocean. We're hoping to start exploring sagas of Christian saints as well in our uphill struggle to convince the public that Viking Christianity is just as interesting as Viking paganism. More saga aimed at kids is in the work as well with our education team to engage children worldwide. And next February, our online Viking festival will return alongside the Jorvik Viking Festival in York City Centre. I've already started to plan out a multi-part video adaptation as well, where viewers will join me and other Vikings around my winter campfire and will hear my adaptation of the saga of Hervor and King Hedrek the Wise, which I've provisionally titled Tjørvang, the Saga of the Cursed Sword. Hopefully, these will continue to inspire interest in Old Norse literature amongst the general public and will continue to challenge misconceptions through the use of fascinating primary source evidence. So if you are interested in viewing or listening to Virtual Viking Sagas, do check out our website next February, thejorvikthing.com, and also look up our podcast, that Jorvik Viking Thing podcast, which is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all other major platforms, with new episodes released every fortnight. We're also always open for episode ideas and for collaboration episodes too with experts. So feel free to get in touch with us at podcast@yorkat.co.uk. So thank you all for listening, and hopefully you will join us around our virtual fireside within our digital longhouse sometime soon and enjoy and learn from our modern retellings drawn from the wonderful and very weird world of Old Norse saga literature.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Oh,
you're welcome.
So do we have any questions? I think Bertram has one here.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Bertram. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, when adapting Havamaul and other poems, how you went about that? in a performing sense, have you tried to make the English translation? Sorry, I can hear myself. My speech is getting weird. Have you tried to make the English translation into a poetic style or a poetic performance in any way, or have you gone the more prose route?
We tend to go the more prose route, to be honest, because a lot of our general audience, they might not be too familiar with the rhythm or the kennings that you get within the poems like Havamal. There are some episodes where we might use the quotation in a more kind of exciting, flowery, poetic style to add a bit of like oomph to the episode. But if we're trying to really communicate the contents of a particular poetic stanza, I personally much prefer that modern English style to avoid any confusion or metaphors that might not really add up in someone's head if they're listening to it on their headphones. So there's a fine line you've got to kind of walk there. Do you be 100% authentic to the source, or do you want to try and make something easily understandable? Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I was trying to translate Himiskvida recently to English. First time I've been translating it into English, and it was a challenge.
Yes.
I was also wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you are trying to implement the animation into your podcast universe.
Yes, so it's a big project we've got particularly for this summer coming up for our Saga of the Volsung series that we're going to do. So we have an in-house animator who is going to start working on those for us, and we're starting by looking at some of the art styles from the period. The characters that appear on runestones, for instance, as well as possibly looking at the interpretation of a story that the Bayeux Tapestry shows us as well. It's borderline Viking, the Bayeux Tapestry, of course. So we're still in quite early stages on that particular side of it. For our more serious kind of formats. But the clip I showed you earlier, that kind of advert one, that's our kind of more typical style of presentation, where we've gone for that more cartoony kind of element, particularly for comedic scenes. That's really useful, you find, for the kids' content that we develop. In terms of how the characters look and in terms of, their hairstyles, clothing, where we have our own costume staff here at Jorvik Viking Centre. There was a bit of discussion about interpretation in the previous talk. We have our own kind of look that we use, drawing upon archaeological evidence. So we try to reproduce the look of our own staff within the animations too, as well, when we come to showing human figures. When it's stuff like dragons and zombies, though, we go all out and go crazy with that.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, we have one here.
Have you done any collaborations with history YouTubers or taken inspiration from them?
History YouTubers, no, we've not yet reached out to any YouTubers. It's something which we do have in mind for future development of the podcast. As I mentioned earlier, we're always open to collaboration. So we have worked with other podcasts before as well. And also we reach out to other academic institutions as well. So people like university lecturers and museum professionals who've got a bit of a presence online. But yeah, YouTube is definitely on our list of things to work on in the future. I'm particularly interested in reaching out to perhaps people who look more at the popular culture aspects. I mentioned, for instance, things like the influence the Vikings had on Lord of the Rings. I know there's so many kind of nerdy fantasy YouTube channels out there that I love. I'd love to talk to them about the influence that Viking literature has had on their modern media they enjoy. So it's in the works, yes.
Well, here, Leah.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk, and really a huge admirer of your museum and everything you do. I was wondering, perhaps can you tell us a bit what's going on, perhaps behind the scenes when you plan these podcasts? I mean, as you mentioned, you sometimes discuss how Vikings are portrayed in other media. Do you see yourself as an alternative to some of those popular perceptions? Or, how much do you discuss how much you use yourself as and how much you yourself are influenced, perhaps, or is it a yeah? Do you discuss how much you're willing to use from Hollywood and popular fiction when you do your podcast, or is it the research that's the top priority? If you does it make sense what I'm saying? Yeah, do you
I think
discuss
so,
this
yeah.
behind the scene? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so behind the scenes, I think a lot of it is on our research that we do. We plan out our episodes quite far in advance, trying to make sure they coincide with calendar events. In terms of the portrayal and its link, the way we portray things in the centre itself, I don't think we talk about that too much on the podcast. Modern media, we do discuss occasionally, and we're quite light-hearted about it. There's horn helmets that pop up. We laugh about it, but not in a disparaging way, hopefully. We're happy for anything that gets people interested in the Vikings, of course. Was that sort of what you were asking?
Do you see yourself as an alternative to some of those other medias, or are you trying to, again, cue our former speaker, bridge the gap between this popular perception and then scholarly-based portrayals?
Oh yeah, I very much hope that we are bridging the gap. Yeah, we are touching upon those kind of popular elements that you'll get in media. And for example, we did a whole episode last year called "The Truth Behind the Legend," all about Ragnar Lothbrok. So I sat there as the guy with the manuscript version, and my colleague Miranda has watched the entire Vikings TV show, so she's got her version of it, and we try and find the middle ground between us there, whilst not trying to sort of dismiss this TV show as going, oh, you shouldn't watch that because it's not completely accurate. No. So I do see us as bridging the academic contents in an understandable format, and then talking about the media, the modern media, and what it has drawn from the real content, what they've invented a little for entertainment purposes, and how we should be able to enjoy both. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. I think, okay, one more last question. Last one.
So, out of curiosity, what is the audience of your podcast? Like, what age group?
Age group. So we looked at demographics a little while ago. It tends to be, let me think, it's people. Different platforms are different, interestingly, as well. There's a whole sort of demographic divide in who uses Spotify and who uses Apple Podcasts. On one platform, we're seeing it tends to be older men are quite interested in it. Older men in Europe and North America. There just seems to be something that they find attractive about the Vikings. I'm not sure what that's all about. And but interestingly, on some platforms, we're seeing younger women in their 20s are a big audience as well. I did show a little map earlier as well, which showed the kind of geographic spread of our downloads too. And we're seeing overwhelmingly it's Europe, North America, or Australia are our main kind of audiences for download there as well. So there's possibly an element there of people who feel a personal connection with the Vikings. Of course, here in England, people often claim they've done a DNA test that means they're Viking, and the countries overseas with that kind of connection via England, they kind of feel a bit of a bloodline connection to the Vikings. So I think they're quite into it. That's the podcast specifically. We do have content we tailor specifically for children as well, of course, via our schools program.
And so, follow-up question: why do you remove polemic topics from the sagas then?
Sorry, can you?
That a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Then why do you remove the polemic subjects from the sagas? If the problematic subjects, if the audience is quite old.
So our audience is, on the whole, it's older. There are things we have to take into account if we do include content that might be quite mature, shall we say. We would then have to limit downloads to people who've got to log in and confirm they're over the age of 18. We don't want to kind of put a restriction on that. If there are, we do have people who are under the age of 18 who seem to be downloading it. We don't want to block them from the contents because we've included a single paragraph that has something a bit sort of raunchy going on in there. We don't do it. We're not being prudish about it or anything like that. And to be honest, a lot of the sagas don't include a lot of that sort of content. I used the saga of the Volsungs earlier as an example, where infanticide and incest pop up. They are actually key elements of the plot in there regarding the hero Sigmund and Sinfjolti. So we are going to have to include those to some extent, but it's how we go about that, because it's very casual the way it's depicted in the source material. If we do ever exclude anything that's quite big, then the discussion section that follows the adaptation, we address that directly. We will say, we've not included the entire story here. There's time constraints to consider. There's also quite a horrific scene, which was very difficult to adapt. I can tell you what happens in this discussion section now. So I don't want to seem like we're censoring anything or whitewashing the sagas or anything like that. It is still there in some form, but we have to be careful about what we portray within that element of the story.
All right, I think that's all we have time for. Let me see, I'm just gonna hop in here so you can see.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much, Lucas. That was really, really interesting hearing about how you communicate history on different platforms. So thank you so much for your talk. And yeah, thank you for today and for joining us.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.